Hello and welcome back to another document deep dive. This time we're looking at the 304th Infantry Division, and this is their position in April 1943. Main front line here, so the Russians were in this direction, in the east, and then there was a second line here and a last line here. And before we carry on with this in more detail, what I want to talk about is the 304th Infantry Division itself. Now, this was a fairly late addition to the roster because it was created in December 1940, and it was created as a coastal defense division, and it spent most of its early days in Belgium, where it defended the coast. So, as you can imagine, kind of an easy gig when it comes to World War II. However, in December 1942, it was rather hurriedly brought to the Eastern Front, and you can imagine why. The 6th Army had been surrounded at Stalingrad in November 1942, and the southern part of the Eastern Front was basically collapsing. Now, the Germans did manage, even though obviously the war was lost after that, because 6th Army was lost, the Germans did manage to stabilize the situation again, with a victory at Kharkov, for example. That said, the division was involved not in that battle directly, but it was thrown into the line in the south, and it was very roughly handled. In fact, we have some quite shocking lists of casualties from January 1943. Now, these here are the overall losses from January 1943. And you can see here fallen. These are officers, NCOs, and men. Fallen, wounded, missing, so probably captured or blown up or whatever, and casualties through frost. And it comes to almost 5,000. Now, in the period that we're looking at, April 1943, they had received and were in the process of receiving reinforcements, some from stragglers that made it back to the lines, some from other divisions that had been dissolved, and some just normal reinforcements, so they were kind of rebuilding, but this shows you that this division was almost destroyed, basically. This here is a detailed list of lost equipment, also from January, although from a slightly smaller time frame. I won't go through all of this, but it starts with weapons, so for example 221 rifle grenade launchers, and you can see sniper rifles, and 213 light machine guns, 34. I mean, this is of course a oversimplification, but basically each of these light machine guns, you could say, represents the firepower of one rifle squad, or one grenadier squad, I guess, at this point. So you can see how roughly handled this was. They lost a lot of equipment, including, quite interestingly here, a 75mm French retooled PAC and stuff like that. Even divisional artillery. I mean, they lost 12 heavy field howitzers with equipment. And then there's lots of different equipment here that might be interesting to some. Ammunition carriers, where you could deploy your machine guns for flak bikes. Then these are the normal infantry horse carriages, as well as these, and these are Russian ones. And field kitchens were also lost. So, yeah. Roughly handled. Back to here. So this was a line in April 1943, and what annoyed the Germans here is that there's this river here, including a reservoir, artificial lake here, and this little village of Elizabetovka. Here it is spelled Elizabetovka. There's different spellings. I will usually call it Elizabetovka because that's easier. And as you can see, the Russians held a quite significant position here over the river, like a bridgehead, and the Germans wanted to get rid of that. Now, by the time we actually look at this in detail, this is from the 18th of April, we will look at it the 22nd of April, and there they had already kind of pushed in the Russians a bit, but mostly by digging forward positions, that kind of thing. But yeah, they wanted to get rid of this position, which was centered on a hill that you can maybe, if you can read topographic maps here, you can see this hill here. This is a hill that the Germans called the Birnenhöhe, or the Pear Height, or Pear Hill. And we will look at this to give you an idea of the 3D topography of this. We will go into Google Earth. Okay, here we are at Elizabethovka today, and this still exists. Now, the landmarks that are important here are, of course, the actual village. There's a hill back here with a rocky outcropping here that the Germans mention, like a little cliff, I could say. There was what's it called, a collective farm in this rough area here. And this is the famous Pear Hill, and this will give you an idea here. The actual village is behind that hill in a depression that was formed, of course, by that river. A Balka, I think, is what this is usually called. Got the reservoir here, although that did not feature much. And this hill here, parts of the hill over the collective farm over there, and these hills here were all in Russian hands and fortified at least to a degree. Now the Germans were mostly established in a ruined village, which is not on the map anymore. I don't know why this is so laggy right now, I'm not doing much here. But there is a village, or there was a ruined village here. You can kind of see outlines of buildings in this area here, but it's hard to tell. This has not been rebuilt, but this was mostly the German position or the German base of operations, and this was a target. So now that you got an overview of the 3D topography, we go back to a flat map that I created, and yeah, this is what this looked like in 1943, roughly. I put in the ruined village here, and obviously the Pear Hill here, and I think this gives you an overview. Now, compared to some of the other AARs that we looked at, especially the ones from 1942, there is not the same kind of massively detailed information on the Russian units that they had back then. In fact, they don't even tell the divisions that they were facing in these documents, and I have not found that information yet. So it seems like the reason behind that is that this was not after a long period of trench warfare. This was after the Germans had been pushed back, and this is where the front had roughly stabilized, right? Now, I did find a reconnaissance report, though, that roughly shows the positions. So, this is the area with these positions put in. Now we will start with the Germans. In the ruined village they had one Pak 38, one 37mm Pak. Now roughly off map here they also had a 75mm Pak and another Pak 38. They had pushed at this point combat outposts. This one, for example, had one LMG and one heavier machine gun, and they, in this reconnaissance report, they did put in these lines here to indicate where they could shoot. So these are their rough fields of fires here. And they also in the Sereshina Valley had mortars and one Pak 38 as well. So they had pushed in quite a bit on the Pear Hill, but it was still in Russian hands. These represent two minefields that the Germans had scouted, and they did not write what kind of units were in these areas, but they marked these areas for Russian strongpoints or field positions. Now, on Pear Hill, they marked down a couple of anti-tank rifles, I think 2 or 3 light machine guns and one Maxim gun. So it looks to me like this was maybe held in platoon strength. A reinforced platoon of Russians was on here. For the collective farm, there is no such detailed information available. So yeah, a bit rougher than what we normally know, but this is what the Germans saw. So they then went about trying to get rid of this Russian strongpoint or this Russian bridgehead, and they called this attack Grasmuecke, which translates to Warbler, the kind of insect that warbles around, I guess. And it says here, the enemy, in a well-developed field position, holds the eastern bank of the Olkovaya sector and with strong combat outposts near Elizabethovka, a bridgehead on the western bank, strong points at the Pear Height and in the collective farm. We saw that. 304th Infantry Division will launch a surprise attack on the night of April 22nd, 23rd, taking the Pear Height and the collective farm, and then establishing a defensive position on the southwest slope of the Pear Height and the collective farm. Of note here is that they want to go out on the southwestern slope, so they know that they cannot hold the forward slope against a Russian attack at this point in the war. So that's interesting. For this purpose, the Stefani Combat Group, no relations to Gwen Stefani, will be formed under the direct command of the division. and these are the units that form this Kampfgruppe or combat group. So the staff of the 573rd Regiment is in command. Now the 304th Infantry Division, as far as I can tell, had 2 regiments at this time, the 573rd and the 575th Regiment. And both of these put units into this attack. So there were these rifle companies. The 4th one was not really directly involved as I can tell, but maybe supplied additional units. There were 2 attack companies, the 2nd of the 573rd and the 1st of the 575th. So these 2 companies attacked. The 7th was a reserve company. There were 2 HMG groups and 2 mortar groups, both from the 575th Regiment in direct support. Both regiments had 1 light infantry gun platoon that they put in, and there also, interestingly, was a heavy infantry gun platoon from the 3rd Mountain Division, which was probably a neighboring division. These would have been the big 150mm ones. And then here you can just read which pack were in support. I think I talked about most of them and showed you some of the positions. And then each of these 2 assault companies were assigned 1 pioneer platoon from the Divisional Pioneer Battalion. Now, we do actually have some quite detailed information on how these companies here were equipped. Here we go. This shows us how strong each of these units were. Small arms aren't in here, but everything light machine gun and up, which are the weapons that really matter to a unit like this. So what we can see here is the 573rd Grenadier Regiment. Here you can see their packs, for example, from the 14th Company, the 2 light infantry guns from the light infantry gun platoon. These were also attached. Now what's interesting here is that they had 6 light machine guns, so this was one of the companies that attacked in the first wave, so to speak. They had 1 officer, 13 NCOs and 82 men, so quite depleted, and they only had 6 light machine guns, so my guess is they were organized as 2 platoons. Something like that is actually mentioned later as well, and each platoon had 3 light machine guns, so 3 squads, and also each platoon had a light mortar in support here. The reserve company down here was equipped much the same and roughly the same strength, but it only had 1 light mortar. Now the 575th was similarly equipped, but the 1st company, that was the actual assault company, was actually weaker. They had 1 officer, 4 NCOs, 53 men, but 8 LMGs for some reason. So these might have been more heavily armed. And again, 2 light mortars, so probably still equipped, or still with 2 platoons, but maybe they had 4 squads in each platoon. I wonder if this represented kind of like or this 1st battalion here was kind of made up of veterans, because one thing that I noticed in both of these battalions is that the 3rd battalion is in decent part equipped with Russian weapons, as you can see here. There's also training companies here, but it looks to me like the 3rd battalion in both of these was kind of hastily thrown together, maybe from reinforcements, and equipped with Russian guns that they had lying around, including Russian anti-tank rifles. And the ones that were actually involved in the attack were veterans that were maybe a bit more competent and better equipped. But that's conjecture on my part. I think this gives you kind of an overview over how these were equipped. One thing I should mention, that these light machine guns, at least in the infantry here, were probably mostly a mix of MG34s and MG42s. In some earlier documents, they report both. They also had Polish BARs for units like this here, which might be under this, and they had some Czech LMGs as well as some older MG0815 and MG13 as well. But these attack companies were probably equipped with MG34s and MG42s. Carrying on with the divisional order, it says here, deployment areas, direction of attack, and targets as determined in the simulation exercise of April 20th, 1943. I have not found documents about that, sadly. Deployment must be completed by 7:30 p.m. and reported to the division with the code word Warbler buzzing. Grasmuecke summt. Yeah, they thought they were so cool. The order to line up and attack is given with the command Warbler stings. So these were the code words, and this is how the actual attack was to be carried out. Combat Group Stefani is to organize and deploy the infantry as follows. On the right, a reinforced 1st Company, 575th Regiment is to be deployed from its deployment in a narrow wedge so that the enemy resistance pockets at pair height are rolled up from the southeast, bypassing the minefield in front of it while simultaneously shielding them to the east. For this purpose, engineered assault troops are to be integrated into the front line, carrying sufficient numbers of submachine guns and hand grenades. So these are the famous Sturmgrenadiers that you often see in video games. They did exist as kind of an almost improvised unit. Then left reinforced 2nd Company, 573rd Regiment, advances in a narrow and deep formation through the Vasyukova Gorge to the northwest edge of the Elizabetovka collective farm. Engineers are to be assigned to the front groups to sweep mines. Ample supplies of submachine guns and hand grenades are to be provided. Same thing here. And then lastly we have the reserve company, which was the 7th one, although it's not mentioned here. The reserve company is to be initially positioned at the junction of the Sterovka and Vasyukova gorges, and later in the attack it is to be deployed through the Vasyukova gorge into the falls approximately 600 meters west of the pair height. Then there's a fire plan here for the heavy weapons. Concentrated fire is to be prepared against the identified enemy strong points of pair height, collective farm, and the village of Elizabetovka, as well as against the pockets of resistance east of Olkovaya, especially the rocky outcrop 192.1. The bulk of the heavy weapons is to be concentrated in the battalion's control. One heavy machine gun group is to be placed under each of the 2 forward deployed rifle companies. Upon reaching the objective of the attack, the infantry is to immediately form a defensive formation and dig in. Reconnaissance up to the Olkovaya sector. Dug in chest deep until 4 a.m. For this purpose, bring in the engineers with explosives, prepare T-shaped mine barriers, or T-mine barriers, teller mines. Only strong combat outposts are to be advanced on the front slope of the pair height, and communication between the attack companies and their neighbors on the right and left is to be established as soon as possible. So the main part of the attacking force would be pushed or pulled back behind the height for cover from Russian artillery. Anti-tank defense. The 2 anti-tank guns, one 7.5 centimeter, one 5 centimeter, deployed on the right wing, are to be positioned at 205.2 to provide armor protection on the eastern flank. That's also on the map. The anti-tank guns deployed at the ruined village are to be deployed in such a way that enemy armored attacks against infantry on the southwest slope of the pair height can be repelled. So lastly, real quick, we can look at the artillery. So the divisional artillery is signed here, signed to each of the sectors, right, middle, and left. What's interesting here is that on the left, so that would be where the collective farm is, they also assigned an independent artillery battalion, namely 21 centimeter heavy siege guns. So they had quite a bit of artillery here. Now, this is the actual combat report, or AAR. That said, I will instead not show you this while reading it and go to the maps that I've prepared. So, again, to remind you, this is the setup. The 2 objectives are the Pear Hill and the collective farm. And it says here, combat report on the execution of Operation Warbler. Structure of Kampfgruppe Stefani as established by order of the 304th Infantry Division. On April 22nd, 1943 at 12 p.m., the division order for the execution of Operation Warbler arrived at the battalion. At 4 p.m. the orders were issued to the company commanders and heavy weapons commanders. The companies marched to the staging area, which was roughly around here. Completion of the staging area was reported. The division staging area was reported at 7:47 p.m. with the command Warbler buzzes, whereupon the division ordered the operation to begin. The order was forwarded to the assault and reserve companies between 7:58 p.m. and 8:01 p.m. with the command Warbler stings. And so you have to see this was started in the early evening, and most of this attack would have been through the night. So if you picture this, picture it in the darkness. The staging area and the approach were not recognized by the enemy. As a result, the heavy weapons that had been aimed at the enemy's main battlefield, divided into several target areas, were not used. So all that heavy artillery that you saw, they did not initially use this because the infantry managed to close in on these areas relatively quietly and without being detected. And so the forward observers that were with the infantry did not trigger these attacks. At 9:16 p.m., a report arrived from the 1st Company, 575th, commanded by Wagner, which is what it will be called in the future. So this is the Wagner Company, via the forward observer of the 8th Battery, that the company was making good progress and had not yet encountered any enemy. So this was the right company. At the same time, Steinkeller's platoon, 1st Platoon, 7th Company, 573rd Regiment, subordinate to the right assault company and advancing through the cable trench to the Pear Height, made its first contact with the enemy. That must have been in this area, the way I understand it. Through heavy machine gun and rifle fire on the identified enemy pockets, this platoon drew the enemy's attention to itself, thus enabling the right assault company Wagner to continue its unnoticed and loss-free approach to the enemy positions from the south. So going in through here. In further preparatory operations, Steinkeller's platoon increasingly pinned down the enemy on the Pear Height, so that Lieutenant Colonel Wagner and his company succeeded, taking advantage of this favorable moment of combat in breaking into the enemy positions and, after capturing the key position at the cable trench in a surprise attack, rolling up the enemy pockets one after the other in a sharply directed attack and driving the enemy from the Pear Height. Long bandworm sentence, typical German. So on the other side, it didn't go quite as well. The left attack company by Henschel was first fired upon by enemy reinforcements in the Wasyukova Gorge shortly after 9 p.m. and, as it continued to advance, encountered a minefield extending across the entire width of the Wasyukova Gorge, about 700 meters south of the Elizabetovka outpost. So I put in the minefield here, as well as the movement later of the reserve company, and Pear Hill being cleared from here by the Wagner company. Let's go back to the AAR. The enemy, now aware of the attack in the ravine, immediately deployed the bulk of its heavy infantry weapons and artillery, which dominated the valley from well-developed and camouflaged positions on both slopes of the ravine and along the stream. You can see the firing positions here, so they were pinned down from these positions and stuck in a minefield, which is not ideal, I would say. By deploying the heavy weapons located in the company and supporting the concentrated fire of mortars, infantry guns, and artillery directed by the combat group, Lieutenant Colonel Henschel succeeded in pushing the attack further through the minefield, and after the pioneer platoon under the company had cleared the way for further attack through the minefield. So yeah, they did push through that, but they did suffer casualties and they were under fire from several directions. Now it gets a bit confusing, because apparently there was another Wagner here who wasn't a company commander but a platoon commander. Wagner's platoon, 1st Company, 525th Regiment, which was attacking east of the stream, so this here, had already bypassed the minefield and, in accordance with its mission, advanced towards the northwest slope of the Pear Height. With sharp action, despite the considerable losses incurred, he succeeded in driving the enemy from the heights and thus neutralizing the flanking enemy action, this would be here, from the Pear Height against Henschel's company. By immediately launching a reconnaissance mission to the southeast, he established contact with Wagner company, so with these guys who came from the other direction, to Wagner, at 10:40 p.m., thus closing the front from the cable trench to the Wasyukova Gorge. So yeah, they had the Pear Hill at this point. The Russians fled towards Elizabetovka. Through the systematic deployment of the 2 platoons of his company and the 1 platoon of the reserve company following him, Lieutenant Colonel Henschel managed to continue the attack despite very strong resistance and a renewed minefield, making excellent use of the strong fire superiority provided by the combat group. So apparently they blasted the collective farm in this area quite heavily, probably with the 21 centimeter howitzers as well. In the meantime, the reserve company had combed the transverse ridges branching south to the Grasmuecke Gorge, so probably this area here. So this is these guys here, and shielded their foothills, thus eliminating any flank threat to the Henschel Company. Henschel Company fought tenaciously and doggedly against the heavy enemy resistance and the obstacles it encountered. Significant assistance was provided, in particular by the forward observers advancing with the company. The well-directed fire of the heavy weapons by Lieutenant Meyer, 2nd Company, 573rd Regiment, and the use of the flamethrowers provided. So the Sturm Pioneers actually had flamethrowers with them to take the collective farm area. After the breakthrough into the first fortified positions at the Elizabethovka outpost at 0:30 am, the enemy's resistance was quickly broken. Both attack companies immediately deployed for defense with the support of the engineers. The quickly created makeshift positions and cover made it easier to repel the enemy's counterattacks, supported by mortars and artillery, which led to a crisis, particularly at 2:20 and 3:10 am, when the Russians succeeded in breaking into the captured positions. Sadly, there's no no maps showing where exactly those counterattacks went in, although you can probably guess. Further enemy attacks, including those against the Grasmuecke Gorge, collapsed under the fire of our heavy weapons before reaching the front line. By dawn, the division was able to report that its assigned objectives had been achieved and that the captured line was firmly in its own hands. This then probably looked something like this. The Germans here on the collective farm and on the Pear Hill, so the front line had been pushed forward so that it was now running across or along the river line here, basically, or roughly. Yeah, which was the goal that they had. Now, at the end of the AAR, they talk about their own casualties. So they had 1 dead, 27 wounded. So not that heavy, at least not in dead, but the wounded might, of course, be very heavily wounded. They made 13 prisoners. Now, here it gets interesting. They say that they captured 1 tank. And it says here einsatzbereit, which means operational, but this is crossed out. And there's a note here, and I cannot decipher this. I don't know what this means. So, the whole AAR does not mention any tank resistance, which you think they would. So this is kind of weird. Maybe there was like a dug-in tank there. It's weird. Anyway, they also captured 2 light machine guns, 5 anti-tank rifles, 4 submachine guns, and miscellaneous rifles, ammunition, and so on. So yeah, that was Operation Warbler, a fairly small and insignificant, but still interesting attack by a heavily depleted infantry division after Stalingrad. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.